So to introduce our topic, today we will be talking about the greatest leadership and development challenge, and that is bringing up children as parents or as educators, particularly in these difficult times. It is a huge responsibility. It is immensely difficult in the best of times, and it is also extremely joyful. We will be talking today about how brains develop in as memorable and useful ways as possible, using analogies and illustrations. I promise this will be fun. We will try to bring it to life, Chemnitz and I, by bringing in and weaving in personal stories and experiences. Okay, and you will have ample opportunity as well to interact with us via several polls and the chat.
All right, thank you. And I'm very excited about this particular workshop. And thank you once again for attending it. And why I'm excited is because we're all aware of the different types of behaviors that we watch our children demonstrate, as well as ourselves demonstrate, but a lot of us aren't very aware of the biological structure on what enables us to act in a certain way. And so what we're going to be doing today is talk about those behaviors, but also talk about the underlying reasons in the context of biology to find out what makes it tick, why it's happening. So answer some of the why. And then once we talk about the why or possible reasons why a person is behaving the way they are, we're going to give some suggested solutions and some some skills and techniques that we all can use to help people work through stressful situations and put them in a resourceful mode where they can navigate their lives more constructively.
Fabulous. So, as Chemnitz said, you will come away hopefully understanding two things. One is how behavior is shaped by the brain, but the brain and body is a very intricately connected entity, and the brain-body unit is truly shaped by bonds. So in this twirly ribbon, you have with the letter B something that you can take away with you, which is that bonds, especially bonds of love, shape the body brain, which shapes behavior. That's number one, and that's where we will spend most of our time. And the second part is we're going to talk about how to best interact with the brain of a developing child, how to give a child the patterns of stimulation that allow it to develop optimally. And a neuroscientist and child psychiatrist called Bruce Perry, I will revert to give you a sense for his book here. The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog is the book at the top. So he puts it very succinctly as regulate, relate, reason. This is the order in which the brain develops over time, from babyhood, early childhood to adolescence. It is also the most effective way to calm someone down or stimulate learning. You know, just always try to remember regulate, relate, reason. We will get into the details. We just wanted to tell you what we will tell you. That is the first tool, and we will interact a lot around it. At the end, Chemnitz will talk about Mosaic's ways of putting this into application. Let's jump in and begin by reflecting for a second, all of us, on the state your brains are in right now. For everyone, the pandemic, the remote back to school in most states, the elections that are looming and the uncertainty this brings, it puts us in a variety of states. So I wanted to ask you all to reflect which of the following three states you identify with right now. Are you balanced, calm, exquisitely responsive to things that might occur to you, either threats or opportunities? Because that's what the brain is essentially there for. The brain is there to keep us alive, which means avoid death, avoid threats, and pursue life, right? Go after what's good for you. And when you're in a calm state, it means that you can avoid danger, but you can also pursue something good. you can also be in a state where you are hyper. That is, everything looks like a threat. Everything is unsettling. Like at the very core, you're afraid of everything, even things that are not threatening. This is something that we feel very frequently. We feel stress, we talk about it. It's also more visible. The other side is less visible, and that's the side of being hypo-aroused, right? When nothing feels like an opportunity, when what Michelle Obama describes as having low-grade depression occurs. Nothing seems too scary. Nothing, the pandemic, whatever, it's somewhere outside my house and I don't want to get out from under the covers. That's when you're hypo. So I'm representing here these 3 states with a speedometer. Everyone in their car realizes that there's an optimal way of functioning. You can be in very high gear, hyper aroused, or you can be in low gear and you're trying to avoid being in those states. So feel free to put in the chat whether you feel that right now you're balanced, hyper, or hypo. I can speak for myself and ask you, Chemnitz, as well, how you're feeling. Preparing this workshop, I think while we were practicing and preparing, just exquisite. Right now, possibly a little bit hyper. And then I am sure that later at night, it will be this is done. Now there's the video and I can see all the things I could have done better. What about you?
Yeah, well, Victoria, from my understanding, what you're sharing is that we all go through these different states, like throughout a day or throughout a moment, right?
Yeah.
And I know for me, I definitely would like preparing for this video would be more of in a hyper state, which means I'd be very excited and nervous, But since I'm in a regulated state of mind, I can bring myself back to a calm state of being, right? But then, once again, I could be in a situation, for instance, if I need to go across the street, I can still find myself in a hyper vigilant state of being because I want to make sure I don't get hit, right? But then once I cross the street, I regulate myself again and get to where I need to go. So basically, we all go through these different states.
Exactly.
Throughout the day. Is that what you're saying?
That's it, Kevin, and that's a great segue into this, which describes a typical person will oscillate across these states in a given day. But then over a long period of time, when we are able to exercise that muscle of homeostasis, which is when we get hyper aroused, we can calm down. When we get hypo aroused, we can stimulate ourselves back up. Then, we're typical and we're functioning in a reasonable way. What happens over long stretches of time, if we become more resilient, now people here who have been athletes or musicians, or, I'll use my cold water swimming analogy, you can notice the difference between these 2 states. Resilient, you have increased the range of stressors for which you are okay. So I'll give you an example from open water. If you Google how long people can survive in open water that is at the temperature between 50 and 60 degrees Fahrenheit, it's about a couple of hours. If you habituate your body, you're able to expand that to much more. So my longest was the crossing from Alcatraz, and it did take me about an hour, and it was in temperature around 60, so it was fine. I wasn't close to death, but also I had habituated over a couple of years. So when I was warming up, I was seeing, the paramedics bring in people in the sauna with a full wetsuit and having trouble to actually keep warm despite the wetsuit. Friends of mine stay in the water for 8 hours or so. So that's resilient. It's when your brain has learned to notice very quickly and adapt more quickly. So you increase your sensitivity to certain things. So for open water, it's your whole circulation system is able to pulse, like open and close, so you don't lose heat, but you keep your extremities alive, right? So in that way, you become hypersensitive. But at the same time, another simultaneous brain adjustment is that you lower the threshold at which you begin shivering like crazy. So this is a very interesting thing for people to know, because we don't fully understand that the stress response has both an element of sensitivity and numbness. We all have both of those things. And for the same challenge, you might be using both. But some people have more of a tendency to develop one side rather than the other. So I'll tell you that, for example, I have a tendency towards being hypo. And that means, more depressed than anxious, needing more stimulants than downers, that kind of thing.
And I guess if you were to ask people who had to raise me, they would definitely say, I fall on a hyper side of things. I was always that individual that need to move around. I remember trying to climb up my wall. I was about 7, seeing if I could be like Spider-Man. So those are just some of the little antics I've done. So I know that I side on the hyper side of things and have to really be mindful to calm myself down.
And I just want to chime in with some of the comments that we're getting from chat. People are feeling fairly balanced, but I would say there's a fair number of people who are feeling more hyper than usual right now, as well as just all over the place, just going from place to place, depending on the day. So that's, I think, a common experience at the moment.
That's great, Sabrina, and it gets us to this this next slide, which shows sensitized. So notice the difference here between typical and sensitized, which is that if you are spending a lot of your time either in hyper or hypo, but that means your stress response is activated chronically over the past several weeks or months, you will be finding that you have become sensitized. And now all of a sudden, where you used to have patience for whatever, you no longer can bear to hear someone whine. I mean, you become just overly sensitive. So we wanted to ask you here, how are you feeling these days compared to your normal state? Is your hyper, hypo, or balanced how you usually feel? Do you feel more sensitized than usual, or do you feel more resilient than usual? Which can also happen. Some people have benefited from the forced kind of confinement to recenter, to take up some activities that were actually quite nourishing. So I know a few people who are feeling more resilient than usual. It's not my case. I don't know about you, Chemnitz, but I've definitely started exercising every day as a way of coping, just to counterbalance that low-grade depression that gnaws at me when things are stressful. How do you counterbalance that extra sensitivity and the fact that you no longer are functioning properly? How do you, what are the coping mechanisms that you use to strengthen yourself or calm down?
Yeah, I get it. So when I feel like I'm in that when I'm stuck in a hyper state, some of the techniques I do to get me out of that hyper state is either I go work out, because then I burn off that extra energy to calm myself back down, or go for, unfortunately, the working out option is very limited these days with COVID-19. I won't be able to go to a gym. So, I mean, I practice martial arts, so I do that, as well as a bunch of push-ups and sit-ups in the living room wherever I can, to bring myself back down.
Yeah, exactly.
Also reading, because I don't have to overexert myself. I can just read for a little while and get my mind off of certain things. That helps a lot as well. I know my wife has always seen me with my head in a book or my head in the phone, because I read off my phone a lot of times. So that helps a lot.
So here's the results of the poll. A few people feel that they're balanced, but more people feel either hyper or hypo. And for most people, this is harder than usual. Let's get into how all of this works. So what we've established so far is that our brain, if it functions well, puts us in a certain state. Sometimes those states don't allow us to see very clearly either the threats or the opportunities. And when these states last a very long time, especially when our brains are developing, because that's where the structures are getting built, then they can become traits. Right? Personality is not something that a newborn arrives with, and we will only see it when it starts talking and moving around. Personality is something that develops over years thanks to these patterns of activation of the brain. So let's dive in and see how it all works. This section is going to be the longer section. We're trying to make it fun, but be patient. It is a little bit technical, right? And that's what you're here for.
Well, this is the exciting part, because we all know about the behavior, but now we want to know why, what's the underlying mechanism of all these.
Exactly.
So I'm excited.
Thanks, Kevin. So welcome to Neuroscience. But I don't want to talk about the brain, in its real neurology, anatomy, because maybe some of you have seen where exactly each part is. It's very easy to find online as well. I don't find that reading about it in this way or learning about it in this way is memorable and actionable. I do want to put the disclaimer that this is scratching the surface of what we understand about the brain. There is a lot more to understand that we do not yet know, but the little I will say is supported by, the sources that I flashed at the very beginning, like a lot of those books, academic papers. These are the sources of information I will be sharing. So the first analogy that we'll be using is an analogy of a tree. Here's why. There is a very famous way of talking about the brain, which is the triune model of the brain by someone called MacLean, who developed that in the 70s. He says that there's the reptilian brain, the mammalian brain, and the neo-mammalian brain. I think many of you might have heard those terms before. Because these are not separate parts, everything in the brain is flows and interconnected. I feel that a tree analogy is useful because in the tree as well, there's the flows going up. So the water captured by the roots as well as nutrients moving up through the trunk and then ending up in the leaves. The leaves create photosynthesis and bring down carbon that they extract from the air to create the sugars and the wood that then grows the whole tree, right? So just like a tree, the brain also has information and networks going up from the deepest layers of the brain upwards, right? So how my body feels will affect how my emotions are, which will affect my thoughts, and top down, my thoughts will affect my emotions and often my body. We will zoom in and overlay a bunch of little animals. So our tree becomes a living totem, okay? So the little animals, if you can see them, this is just a very big picture. There is dinosaurs to represent the reptilian brain, right? The mammalian brain I'm representing here with furry animals, a goat and a squirrel. And the neo-mammalian brain I'm representing with the Statue of Liberty of sorts. The reason why is because the right hand and the left hand are quite different in the Statue of Liberty, and you know exactly which is which. So the right hand holding the torch is the torch towards new knowledge. So the brain hemispheres, the right side is the one that is more activated towards novelty and discovery. And the left hand, which holds whatever it is that it actually holds, but I call it the to-do list or the knowledge that you have acquired, that's the left side of the brain. So when we talk about being left brain and right brained, again, that is a myth that needs to be dispelled. We are not all one or the other. The whole brain is involved with pretty much everything. But if there is some lateralization, this is one that is actually significant. So based on that, where would you say the language centers of the brain are, left or right?
I would guess the left, right? The script.
Exactly. You've got it, right? Once you've got it, it's on the left side. So you will notice that there are two connectors to those three parts, a connector at the bottom and a connector at the top. The connector at the bottom I've represented as angry birds, and that is our stress response system, okay? That's, what keeps us alive, what keeps us avoiding big threats. And then the other connector I've represented as, flying puppies, because they're mammals. So I wanted to have dogs up there, whereas the birds are descendants of the dinosaurs. So it makes more sense to have them down here. So the happy puppies are the dopamine reward system, which is kind of connecting the emotions to planning, deciding what to do. And these are what keeps us approaching life. So avoiding death, approaching life, and the three big parts. Okay, so there's 5 things, and we will zoom into them.
Well, I want to make sure I'm getting this, because a lot of forestry and statues. So I want to make sure I got a better understanding of this whole situation. So with the brain analogy, right? So this is an analogy for a brain, and you're saying the roots, which is the oldest part, okay? Which is represents the reptilian brain. And then the trunk, which is the second oldest, which is the mammalian brain, right? Yep. And then you have the foliage, you call it. So the frontal cortex, the foliage represents that, which is the newest part of the brain.
Yep.
So that, and then you talked about the 2 sides with the Statue of Liberty holding one, so the left and right. I think I get that part. But then here's where I got a little fuzzy. So you have the dinos. So these are the dinosaurs, are the ones that communicate to the trunk.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
And then the dinos. And then the bad, what do you call them? The bad birds, the scary birds, the what birds?
The Angry Birds. Angry Birds was a game.
Ah, okay, the Angry Birds. So Angry Birds are ones that communicate. Where did the Angry Birds come from again?
We'll get into the details. So let's zoom in. But thank you for stopping me here, kind of at this overview level, because there's a couple of other things that you're alluding to that I think are worth mentioning. So as a tree has like big roots and big foliage, right, and a thin trunk, the same with the brain. Almost all of our brain cells are actually in the deepest parts of our brain. And that's something that surprised a lot of people. 80% of our neurons are in that cerebellum, brainstem, midbrain areas.
Oh, okay.
So that's huge. So picture a tree with the roots, the heavy wood in the soil. That's the foundation, right? The trunk is the passage of all the flows, those going up and those going down. So it's good to know that the key role of that middle trunk, the mammalian brain, which has the amygdala, the hippocampus, we will get into that, has to do with learning. So what is worth remembering from what your body is going through. And then the top, which takes a lot of space, 80% of our mass is the top. It actually has only 20% of the neuron heads, but they're doing the neurons. Actually, I have from a previous class.
5:36 p.m.
I have I did some sample neurons for a class for kids. So you've got the head of the neuron, and then you've got all sorts of synapses, the axon, and another bunch of synapses. So at the very top, up here, you have maybe 20% of the neuron heads, but there is a tremendous amount of spaghetti going around, right? There's a lot of connections happening between those. So it takes a lot of space, but it's going to be less powerful in calming you down. Like the flows from the top down are going to be less powerful than the flows from the bottom up, right?
Oh, wow.
The way your body feels will have more to do with your well-being than whatever is in your mind, whatever you think, right? This is a bit counterintuitive. A lot of people think, if only you know what the right thing to do is, you should be able to do it. And if you don't, it's a failure of character. Why did you have that third pint of ice cream? You knew it wasn't good for you. But, when your body feels a certain way and things are dysregulated in the middle, the top is not that powerful. So getting to the roots first. The brainstem, the midbrain, and the cerebellum are represented by this massive dino. And it does what we don't need to think about. This is a part of the brain that takes care of breathing, blood pressure, glucose levels in the blood, your temperature, your heartbeat, digestion, like so many things that thankfully we don't have to think about are done automatically. These are done together with 2 mini dinos, because we're talking about the central nervous system, what's in your skull, what goes down your spine, and then what touches all of your organs and all of your muscles. There is the peripheral nervous system that allows you to move, to learn how to play the piano, the violin, like all of that is from the top down. But there's also the autonomic nervous system, which is, oh, you know, my digestion is telling my deepest parts of the brain something about, you know, something was wrong, let's evacuate, you know, there's food poisoning happening, or I'm hungry, blood sugar level is low, you know, please pursue that extra piece of food. So that's why there are 3 dinos at the roots. Right. This autonomic nervous system is split into 2. There's the sympathetic nervous system, which I call tug, right? Because it's constantly tugging and asking to spend energy. Hug on the other side, and he's holding everyone with a strap that is the vagus nerve, and it quietens everyone. Tug is fight or flight, hug is rest and digest. And they have this little dance going on to keep us in the middle and balanced, noticing things to avoid, things to pursue. So what happens is, if things are working well and they've learned to kind of pulse together, then we are optimally engaged. If hug lets go of that strap, tug is hyperactive, right? But on the other side, if hug kind of yanks the vagus nerve, you can have a total collapse. And that's what happens in a situation of burnout. That's what happens in a situation of inescapable stress. So if you're stressed but could run from it or fight it, then you're in a better spot than if you are stressed and actually it's uncontrollable, overwhelming. That's what we call toxic stress. That's when you will preserve your life. You have better chances of preserving your life if you slow down your heart, if you lower your blood pressure, so that in case you get injured, you're not going to bleed too fast. I mean, that's the origin of that. But what you see in children, here I'll share a personal story. I was hospitalized when I was a tiny, like a kind of a couple of months old infant. And back in the early 70s in Germany, parents could not be with the children at all. So for a long stretch of time, multiple weeks, I was not in contact with my parents at all. And my parents never really talked to me about that. Only just by chance I found out much later. But they did always say that I was such an easy baby because not whining at all. And that's when an infant at a very early stage, you know, just basically shuts down, then it becomes easy to neglect that child. And I'm not saying my parents were unloving or neglecting, but having multiple children, the ones that whined, as they say, the squeaky wheel gets the oil. So I was not squeaky.
I was definitely squeaky. There was a lot of oil cans all around my house. I was definitely the squeaky wheel, and made my presence known growing up pretty much. Would you consider that more of a tug? So I was a tug kid?
In those deep areas of your brain, the interaction between hug and tug was such that tug was probably, you know, loosening that strap. There's a couple of things that can go wrong. In addition to, you know, just hug not being strong enough, the other one is that the two are not salsa dancing effectively. They're either both kind of not functioning, or they're both activated at the same time. So children with behavioral issues, either internalizing or externalizing behavioral issues, there's ways of measuring certain metrics about heart rate, about skin conductance. You know, there is something called respiratory sinus arrhythmia and so on. I don't want to get into the technicalities, but these are metrics that go down to those levels of the brain. There's another set of metrics, which is kind of the cortisol level in your blood. And we will get into that now.
All right.
So let's talk about the stress response system, and those are the angry birds. Essentially, it's two small areas that are in that center part of the brain, the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland, which together with the adrenal gland somewhere else in our body, they produce a number of neurotransmitters and hormones which prepare us to fight or flight. One personal story, again, a way in which I became very suddenly aware of my stress response system was during a train ride, maybe 20 years ago. It was a wonderful moment where I was in a train Friday night, headed to another city where I would celebrate the weekend with my boyfriend, about to have a great dinner. And then my sister calls with a sad piece of news about a friend of hers. But her grief had this instant cascade of reactions in my body where the appetite was finished. The temperature dropped. I started shivering. My mouth was dry.
Yeah, I guess I can relate to that. I know because I grew up in a very active and maybe a stressful environment that I guess the one time I could think about is there was a particular day where like my son's likes closing doors really loud, even slamming doors. And even though I knew nothing externally was really bothering me, I think the act of slamming doors and a lot of yelling, I definitely felt angry birds flying around. I wasn't really conscious of it at the time, but I knew I was feeling more agitated for whatever reason. It wasn't until I had to stop and think about it, and I realized just with the slamming of doors and maybe the yelling around, pretty much stimulated a more angry bird response. And fortunately, I was able to figure it out. But
yeah,
that gives me the idea, like how those things come up, right? You said they come up. It's more stronger, more older. And
exactly.
get that whole top-down understanding.
Exactly. So much comes from the bottom, and I love how you use that. It's just coming up.
Mm-hmm.
We post-rationalize. Then we're like, no, I got angry because of that reason. And you're like, no. You were angry before that happened. So moving up this tree, we've got the trunk. The amygdala is commonly referred to as the fear center of the brain, and the hippocampus is most commonly associated with memory. So I'll give you just a couple of very brief stories. The amygdala of some people who unfortunately became serial killers sometimes have been found as having a tumor that was affecting the amygdala or on the amygdala. But I don't want us to remember the amygdala as something that we're better off without. The amygdala is not only the seat of fear and aggression.
Yeah, because most people just say that's the fear thing, right?
Yeah, but it's actually the intensity of feeling. And the hippocampus pays attention to things that are worth paying attention to. If we were storing every piece of information that we go through in life, we would not be able to function. So the squirrel who hides its nuts all over the rest of the brain, so that's the little part that encodes memories, he is tied to the hip with the amygdala that tells it what to pay attention to. Now, the trick is this: the amygdala needs to be awake enough that the hippocampus cares, but not too dysregulated, not too activated that the hippocampus loses his marbles, right? That happens often when we are eyewitnesses to either a crime, a violent scene, an accident. Very often, eyewitnesses just are not very reliable because we are so shocked that we cannot remember.
What you're saying, if the amygdala is more active, it makes it harder to recall things. Is that correctly?
If it's true, exactly.
But yet we still need the amygdala active because you want to be able to be aware or alert for learning new things. It really helps me understand what we've been doing at the Mosaic Project for years now, and why we explain why we need to get into a certain situation to learn new things. And we call it a comfort zone. And when you're in your comfort zone, that's pretty much when you're very relaxed and not very stimulated. You're very calm, which is a good place to be, right? But yet, if you want to get into a state where you're ready to take in new information, we call that moving from out of your comfort zone into your stretch zone, right? And your stretch zone, I would guess, Victoria, from what you're saying, is where your amygdala is stimulated at a reasonable level, right?
Yeah.
Making you more alert to learn new things. And so while you're in this stretch zone or growth or change zone, we like to call it, this is where you are able to take in new information, you're alert, you're awake, and you're ready to take in new stuff. Yet, we have another area outside of the stretch zone we call it the rip zone, which is the further out area. And that's where you would think the amygdala is now too stimulated, and now you're not learning anymore, and you're just too overwhelmed by whatever type of emotion that's being overly stimulated, right?
Yeah.
In order to stay into a learning state, which we call a stretch zone, it's good to keep the amygdala up and running and awake, but you want to keep it asleep, staying in the comfort zone all the time.
If you are exposed to, let's say, a speaking assignment, right? But beyond your ability, beyond your preparation, it can be a traumatizing experience. You can get on stage and then, take a long time recovering from the fact that it didn't go the way you wanted it to go. What exactly constitutes your comfort, your stretch, and your rip is, a level of stress, which will depend on your state, your age, what you're used to. As we talked about in open water, you can be, swimming for 4 hours. It can be okay for someone. It can be deadly for someone else. Stress in and of itself is not bad. To be activated, stimulated, and then to learn to bring yourself back to homeostasis, that is a muscle that you're exercising, right? Get stretched and then get back to normal.
Yeah. That's why we use the whole rip terminology at that stretch zone, because you don't want to get on the dance floor really quick and do a splits, or else you're going to rip something. As I illustrated before, you have the comfort zone, which is, comfort. Your amygdala is a very restful level,
So moving along from the amygdala and the hippocampus into the, towards the front parts of the brain. And here we're talking about the dopamine reward system. So in addition to avoiding death, we want to pursue the good things in life. The good things in life include food, sex, the obvious. But also, some people who are shown pictures of fast cars will have this neurotransmitter called dopamine flooding their system. Or cooperation, more hopefully for the human race. When we cooperate, it actually makes us feel good. Another thing that makes us feel good is punishing people who break rules. So that's why you're seeing all of this excitement right now about he didn't wear a mask, she didn't wear a mask.
Wow.
Getting, on our high horse to get people to follow rules, it triggers something in our brains. So that's the dopamine reward system. I call them happy puppies because they get excited. What goes wrong here, if someone is very stressed, and there's cortisol flooding the system, you may find that in these two nuclei, the ventral tegmental area and the nucleus accumbens, those two little puppies, the dopamine receptors start shrinking and disappearing. So the dopamine levels, so the level of neurotransmitter that creates this happiness drops, but also even if it didn't drop, the neurons are not as sensitive to it. And so you need higher and higher stimulation to get the same result. And that's where you fall into addictions that lead you to either taking extraordinary risks, like wanting to cross the English Channel 4 ways rather than just one, or eat too much, or smoke too much, or taking frequent doses.
That explains bungee jumping.
Yes. There you go. Exactly.
Wow.
Exactly. And finally, the prefrontal cortex. So we talked about her a little bit. The prefrontal cortex is only one part of the cortical areas that are connected to behavior. There's also the insula, the anterior cingulate cortex, the parietal lobe. So there's a lot more. But the prefrontal cortex, I'll just tell you one thing and you can look it up, but we're running out of time. We didn't know what it was good for the longest time. And so we thought it was totally useless, basically. Until this railroad worker from California called Phineas Gage in the late 1800s had a terrible accident that he survived, for several years, but it was the most gore accident that you can see. You can read all about it online. The guy had a rod go through his head. He lost the vision of one eye. The big rod just exploded and landed really far away, but he stood up with a hole in his head, parts of the brain spilling out.
Oof.
And his personality changed quite dramatically. It's one of the best known stories in science. So you can Google his name, Phineas Gage. I'll type it into the chat.
I would guess some of his personality changed. Man, that's rough.
That was rough. Yeah, his personality changed. He became quite disinhibited. Another way in which, if you have a prefrontal cortex that is not developed or that has been damaged, you can also just be very apathetic, lack of initiative. So it is the part of the brain that helps you decide, take initiative, plan, and in that way it collaborates obviously with all the parts that we've talked about before. So zooming out to just take a big picture, what I would like people to remember from this is not that, oh, hippocampus memory, amygdala fear, this, stress is only there. Everything is pretty much everywhere. And if a child grows up in extremely difficult circumstances, you can find an effect in each part of that brain. And everything that follows that foundation will be affected. So starting from tiny infancy, where people think, oh, it's just a baby, they won't remember, who cares, leave them in the hospital for a few weeks. Like when my mother was called to pick me up, she said, oh, could you keep her for a few more days because I'm busy. So people don't realize, especially not back then, that certain things are really impactful, even though a baby will not remember specifically what happened. The patterns of activation that happen in hospital-like settings are quite, or used to be, before John Bowlby explained it with a great report to the World Health Organization, which changed all hospitals worldwide, that attachment really matters for the brain, for the nervous system of babies. Another example, if we're talking about the whole brain, I'll just be very brief. The children, you know about Romania's orphans. Ceausescu regime did not allow women to have contraception or abortion, resulting in a tremendous, like hundreds of thousands of children that were not wanted, could not possibly be raised by their families, growing up in institutional settings of extreme deprivation, extreme relational deprivation. They were adopted very early, many of them before age 2, by families across the world. I know of families in America, but all over Europe. And recently, The Guardian published an article on the studies that show the result after 25 years, things that they're observing in the brain, the whole brain of these young adults now. And they're finding, that the sequelae are there. So although we can say, brain plasticity, you can become anything, it doesn't really matter as long as you set your mind to it. Well, if your very early babyhood was so deprived, you might not be able to develop a brain strong enough to achieve what you want to achieve. And what they found in those now young adults is brains that are on average 10% smaller, where the alpha, beta, gamma waves are not in the usual patterns, a lot more ADHD, and certain other things. So yeah, but you don't have to have that level of deprivation to be affected. I just wanted to use that as an extreme example of deprivation.
So what I'm getting from that, what you're saying is relationship matters, right? So, and the brain is significantly influenced by whatever type of relationship it's in the middle of, right? And that makes me think of some of the people I grew up with. And I only knew this from an outside looking in perspective, whereas I know depending on the type of relationship someone has is going to affect the way they behave later on in life. Like for instance, I grew up with a friend, let's just call him Roger for now, who used to get significantly beat a lot. He either got beat by his father, unfortunately, or he used to get picked on a lot by other people in the neighborhood, and which was rough, which is very sad. And he left because apparently he started getting into more trouble, and would go to juvie a couple of times and just had a rough life and started continuing that rough life. And then it wasn't until years later when I was in college and watching the news, and there was he on this news wanting for murder, so he was a wanted murder. And when seeing that news broadcast, it made me realize how important relationships are and that there's a story behind every situation. I think sometimes we get locked into just a snapshot of an individual right here and right now. But from what you're saying, with you talking about the young babies and all that stuff, is that there's a story behind all of that, right? Like nobody is born wanting to be a criminal. Nobody is born wanting to be out on the streets. It's about what happened up to that moment.
Exactly. It's what happened to you, not what's wrong with you. Exactly.
Right.
Exactly. Yeah. Wow. Thank you for sharing. It's a very poignant story, a very sad one. But
yeah.
Heavy stuff and a lot of content. Let's shake our, if you're sitting, you can get up and have a bit of a break. Take a brain break. We can put the music on and then reconvene. It's important for our brains to engage, disengage, and then we will be able to shift gears and talk about kids.
Is that even though people in challenging or traumatic relationships or hurt relationships can also heal as well, right? Because I grew up in that same environment, and I definitely got in fights and I definitely got beat up a couple of times, and yet I still had people in my life who was that anchor for me as well, right? So, so relationships can be a blessing and a challenge at the same time. It just depends.
Exactly. That's what, the message is that less than your history of adversity, what will determine how well you do today is your present connectedness.
Right.
Who are the relationships in your life today? And that's what you can work with. We wanted to shift gears here and focus our attention on how to help children. And what this group is seeing is that children are majority showing more externalizing behaviors. Some are seeing more internalizing behaviors, more reserved, more numb. There's a lovely movie made by a teenager called Numb. It's a 3-minute short film, which is gripping. So I would advise those of you who are teachers of adolescents to watch that. And then a couple of people are finding them more balanced, which is great. And a couple are feel not noticeably different than before, which is also a good sign. Great.
Victoria, do you have a moment to take a question? We have a raised hand.
Sure, yep.
Jenny, go ahead.
Hi, I actually had a question, but I think you might have already answered it. I was curious about how people with different backgrounds can end up going in different directions with their lives. So some people might have a very difficult upbringing, but then turn it around. And then other people might have, what appears to be, a wonderful upbringing and then turn around and do things like rape. And I'm just curious about what the explanation might be, or if there is even one, because I try to do my best as a parent, but as I know, there's no guarantees. So I was just curious.
And you're saying we might have answered it. So where would your go in terms of where the answer might be?
So I made a note that it's more than your history it's your current connectedness in terms of like your relationships that exist in your life at this present moment.
That's definitely on the right track. And yeah, it is relevant on what type of connections you do have in your life. That's why it's no cookie cutter situation, because as you just mentioned, there's people who grew up in very challenging life situations and yet still turned out to be able to make something good about it. As you said, there's people who grew up in very luxurious and a very fine and well environment and still turned out to be a detriment to society, right? And I think the key denominator or a common denominator is the relationships that they have in their life. and people who care about them, you know.
Is it people that see them, that empathize, that validate, that listen? Like, is it those things that make it, that choose the relationship with the child over anything else? Like, is it would it be something like that?
There is someone called Bessel van der Kolk, who's also a psychiatrist working out of Boston. He wrote another fantastic book called The Body Keeps the Score. And what he says is that the way you approach someone who has had adversity, typically in hospitals or in the medical professions today, is, check this list of adverse childhood experiences. Do you have a parent who's, mental illness? Do you have a parent who's incarcerated? Do you have, and it's just a yes, no answer. And he's saying it's actually pretty meaningless. I mean, it's a start. It's great that this movement of adverse childhood experiences exists, because it has shown that there is a connection between your experience and health outcomes. But the more meaningful question is, how young were you? How often did these things happen? Who was it? Was it your father, as in Chemnitz' story case, who was beating you up, or was it some bully? In which case, were the more important relationships inside your home nurturing? Bessel van der Kolk says that the way he approaches someone that he's meeting is by asking also, who makes you feel safe? Where do you feel safe? Is there someone who makes you feel great? And it can be an aunt or a cousin or someone at the school if your parents are not those people. But trying to identify who are the relationships that can work as a buffer for a child as they're living through adversity can really explain a lot of the differences later on. But there are so many factors, as you say, that it's very hard to say.
Yeah, but I think the hopeful thing is, though, at least from my own personal experience, it doesn't matter when it happens in that person's life, but if they meet up with someone who authentically wants to listen to them and talk with them, then that's definitely a move in the right direction for that person. With me working with the transitional age youth who are homeless and who are, they had contemplated suicides, or they had drug abuse challenges, and so considered, kids that were done in life. Unfortunately, people thought that. But these same kids, I would sit and talk with them for anywhere from 10 to 15 to 25 minutes, just sitting there talking with them, listening to them, and see that they felt like someone was actually with them.
Yeah.
Right? And even just dropping that seed. And I would suspect the more that would happen in someone's life, the more that person can unfreeze themselves out of traumatic behaviors, I guess, challenging behaviors.
And now let's get into how we help children. This will appear like a very simple tool. We've represented it as an ice cream, again, to make it memorable. If you're strategic about the way you create your ice cream, you put the most intense flavors near the cone. So if you imagine that the cone is your body, the most intense flavor, whatever that is, chocolate with hazelnut, I'd put that at the bottom so it fuses with the cone. That's the whole point of the ice cream, is to eat those last bites, Then I would put, a cherry sorbet, and then the fluff at the top, either vanilla or lavender, or even just whipped cream. If you have in your arms a child that is tantruming, dysregulated, crying, sobbing, what do? This tool gives you a sense for the order in which you can be more effective. I'll take a quick example from my early years at the Child Abuse Prevention Center. There was a child that was left to me, a new volunteer, and its mother walked out the door, and the child was maybe around 1 or 1.5, and completely sobbing and inconsolable. So I was obviously holding her in my arms, but I jumped straight to, okay, regulate, try to bounce, but then reason. I was like, okay, look, your mom is gonna come back in this much time. Here, I'll show you which meeting room she is in. Let's walk outside, I'll show you a window. The child was inconsolable. And another volunteer who was more experienced also gave her a hug, but sat down with her in front of the door where her mother had just left. and she said, "You are so sad. Your mother just left." And the child began to trust her. It's like, you hear me. It is only after that that you can eventually start getting into reason. So this very simple tool, I'll let chemists go into how Mosaic uses that, but it is deceptively simple. I believe that as you go through a number of interactions with children, or even reflecting back on a number of interactions that you have had, that you will find that either this is the natural way in which you also already do things, or that this is something that can improve the way you address children. And I would say not only children, even adults, everyone.
And so, yeah, the Mosaic Project has been using what we call the 5 tools of conflict resolution. And these are tools that's been working. I've used it a lot, even outside of work. And these are tools that were used to help guide people and to help settle people into a state where they are ready to talk. You know, for instance, the first tool that we use, number 1, is stop, cool off, and take a deep breath, right? And that would fall under the regulating option within your metaphor, right? You need to regulate. So you definitely don't want to try and discuss anything that's serious, significant, without being centered. You need to regulate yourself, take care of that bottom portion of the ice cream to regulate. And then another part of regulating is being able to listen, which is the second tool, to listen to the person, get a better idea from where they're coming from. So once again, and you know, that can also fall into the reasoning aspect of it, but let's stick that with regulating. And then the other part of it is empathizing. Empathizing definitely would fall under, which is tool number 4. So I'm jumping around a bit, but tool number 4 would be a regulating process, right? So if I had to be very explicit or cling to it, number 1, stopping, cool off, taking a deep breath. And then number 4, empathizing, is definitely a regulating process to be able to regulate with someone. And then, or regulate yourself, empathizing with yourself even. And then you have the tool number 2, which is listen. And then 3, talk. You know, that can fall in the area of relating to somebody. So you want to listen to the person, you relate to them, get what they need. And also empathizing is relating as well, right? So you can definitely do that as well. And then the talking aspect would fall into the reasoning level, I would think, where you're getting to share your personal experiences, you know. And when we talk, at least when we talk, we call it I statements. And basically what we mean by that is being able to share your story. What happened to you? How do you feel about it? What are your needs, right? And basically sharing your reality with that person is what we mean by I statements, right? And the 5th tool is making up a plan. And when you are able to get to that level, this is definitely the reasoning aspect. And when you get to that 5th tool, that's where you guys are talking and seeing how you can get each other met, right?
Great.
So, once again, we do call these the 5 tools of conflict resolution, but just be the 5 tools of regulating a relationship, you know? So.
On the support line where I volunteer at the Child Abuse Prevention Center, so every week I am on the line, I call people and people call in, and essentially what they teach us is very much this. So you try to soothe the person who's calling. Very often they're calling in a crisis. You try to soothe with your voice, with the firmness, the confidence, the pace of your voice, helping people breathe. Another way that we do the regulating is to say, okay, we're going to talk for this amount of time. What are you going to do right after that? And having them say, okay, I'm going to make myself a cup of tea. I'm going to then pick up my favorite book and I'm going to go to bed. It helps. So giving a framework and a contained structure helps regulate. Then the other thing that we do with people is reflect their feelings. Sometimes you may also add your own feeling. If it's not too overwhelming, you can say, you know, I feel very sad, hearing the sadness in your voice. You know, so you can, that's a way to teach empathy. It's, here's what you're telling me, and I'm showing you how it makes me feel. So that goes both ways. And then in terms of reasoning, if we get there, is we help with 2 things most frequently. One is ambivalence. You know, you love being a mother and you're also totally overwhelmed right now. So holding the ambivalence, getting people to feel, okay, it's okay to have those ambivalent, confusing feelings. And the second thing we do is alternatives. So what have you tried already? What
Mhm.
could you try? What do you want to achieve? And all of this makes me think of the prefrontal cortex, planning, decision making. But you only get to that after you've done the two other things.
I think the one thing that we miss out on, I know I can have to catch myself a lot of times, is when I'm talking to a child who's very triggered, very emotional. And then, for instance, one child who got basically, they were very pissed off that they got hit with the ball. Hit with the ball. They were playing basketball at the court, at our outdoor, and they were very angry that they got hit. And it wasn't that bad, but they definitely had something to feel about it. And there's two ways of taking that. You could go to the child and talk with them and go, oh, well, you're not that hurt, so it was not that bad, right? But then again, when you do something like that, that's discounting their reality once again. And that doesn't, that's not really empathizing with them. So that's one way of doing it. And I can almost, that's almost my initial reaction. If I don't see they're hurt, I go, come on, you didn't get hit with the ball that hard. It's not that bad, right? But that's not going to validate their reality. Yeah. So what I did instead was, well, I see you're upset. That ball must have really hurt. Go, yeah, it did hurt. Really? Pretty made you mad, huh? Go, yep. Did you want to hit him? What do you want to do about that? Well, yeah, I want to hit him. No, so I had that conversation about the reality about getting hit with that ball. And then once I had that conversation, connected with them, and then they were no longer upset and tears were no longer falling and they weren't doing that stuff anymore, right? That's where I felt like they were starting to calm down. They were breathing more deeply and they were having a more sound conversation with me. And I go, all right, well, so what would you like to do about it? And they were like, well, I don't know. I could probably go play something else. I go, you could, but do you want to go talk with what's his name? When I hit you the ball? And they go, I don't know, think I should. But think again, I would not have gotten to that point of having a conversation and making a plan until I sat down and empathized with that child's reality, right? I think as adults, a lot of the times we project our own reality onto them. We may not think they got hit with that ball very hard, but to them, they got hit with that ball really hard, right? And so you climb into their world, into their reality, and have them talk about what they just experienced. That helps them calm down. And it also shows that you care about them, right? And then once you get them calming down, once you get them into that regulating state, then you start talking about other stuff, But I think a lot of times as parents and as adults, we skip over that because we want the solution right away. All right, what's the problem? How can I solve it? Instead of sitting there in the reality and talking with them and getting a better idea on how they feel and what their reality is like.
Got it. That's right. Kevnes, I'm just conscious of time. And for those who need to have a hard stop at 6:30, which is right now,
I
want to let people know that there's many ways of keeping in touch with us. And also, tell people that we're happy to stay on and continue conversation and sharing. But unfortunately, we've gotten to the end of the allotted time. So for those who want to go, I'll let Sabrina kind of wrap it up. And I'm happy to stay on for a few minutes if people want to share.
Time flew, man. We only took about 5 minutes, right? Was it been 5 minutes?
Yeah, that was an hour and a half. Thank you so much, both of you, for this presentation. I know I feel much more grounded in terms of my understanding of how the brain works, so that I know why why certain methods work, and others don't. And thank you for the tools as well, Kevnes. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Again, I'm Sabrina. I am the chair of the Mosaic Project. You can find us. A bunch of links were shared in the chat on our website. Feel free to connect with us at Instagram. This is part of an ongoing speaker series that we have, so please join our email list. We'd love to keep you in touch. And we will send out an email tomorrow with a link to the video as well as slides for anyone who had to drop off early. Feel free to share those with friends as well. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you, Victoria and Kevnes.